Is it, we got rid of the feedback?
We got rid of the feedback?
Is there an echo in here? I don't know. That's a hard act to follow with all the strange. I was waiting back there, and I started hearing a lot of strange sound effects, and I thought, my God, we having another rock and roller? I was down in L.A. a week and a half ago when we had the big one. I was staying with some friends. I went in their kitchen and threw some garbage in the trash compactor, and the trash compactor started making the noises it usually makes, and I started leaving the kitchen, and then I heard louder noises, and then instead of just the trash compactor shaking, all the walls started shaking. And I thought, my God, what did I do wrong? And then I started to go back to the trash compactor to see if I could turn it off, and then the whole house was shaking, and I thought, oh, I didn't do this after all. Unless I'm God, as the Hindus keep telling me I am. So I got out of the house, and I thought, that's the thing to do in an earthquake, get out of the house, isn't it? And by then the earthquake was over. And people have been talking about it ever since. It was 20 seconds, but 20 seconds that really gives you a chance to philosophize. At least it brought me to the conclusion that every coincidence in my life isn't a synchronicity. At least I would hate to think that one was a synchronicity. I suppose you wonder why am I so weird? Well, back in 1942, when I was 10 years old, my mother and a friend of hers were playing with a Ouija board. And they were asking the Ouija board various questions. I forget what they were. The other woman, whose name was Olga, asked the Ouija board where a lost article was, and the Ouija board told her to look behind a bureau or something like that. And I was doing my homework, and I suddenly got a bright idea. I said, ask it when the war will end. That was the big war. As a matter of fact, it's the one that most people of my generation consider the good war. Although I never saw anything particularly good about it. But they did ask the Ouija board, when will the war end, at my suggestion. I think that's the first time adults ever listened to anything I had to say, and that may be part of the reason I remember this. So they asked the Ouija board, when will the war end? And the Ouija board said, August 14th, 1945. So I wrote that in my school notebook on the back of the cover, August 14th, 1945. It astonished me, because I had been hearing a lot of propaganda on the radio. There was an Office of War Information at that time, which was putting shows on the radio to tell us how wonderful America was and how soon we'd beat those nasty little Japs and have the war over with. And I thought the war would be over in 6 months. So it astonished me that the Ouija board said the war would go on for 4 years. And then came August 14th, 1945, when the treaty was signed, and I remembered, and I looked in my notebook, and there it was. The Ouija board had given a correct answer. And I've been a little bit weird ever since. Of course, when I was in high school, I learned the scientific explanation of that type of event. I had a teacher in physics who explained that by probability theory, there must have been a lot of people asking Ouija boards, when will the war end? And most of them got wrong answers, and just by sheer coincidence, I happened to be in the room where the right answer came up. Well, that explanation makes sense if you...
Try that. Both microphones are on. Now one of them is off. So, sorry about
that. Is this pick up for the audience or just for yours? Just for, yeah. Okay.
This is for the audience.
Mm-hmm. This one is now off.
This is lots of fun.
Please stand by. We're experiencing technical difficulties. We will return to the lecture momentarily. In the meantime, no entertainment.
I got my picture, but I don't have my glass.
Ta-da! Okay, is that better?
You know, you can get exactly the same effect as cocaine by putting talcum powder up your nose, rubbing it in with sandpaper, and then running around the house burning all the money you can find. If you do that every day for 30 days, the effect is exactly like a month on cocaine, especially when you look at your bank balance. But no, cocaine is just nature's way of letting you know you have too damn much money. I was delighted when I got back. I live in Ireland, I suppose most of you know. I was delighted when I got back to this country and found Ronald Reagan had really done something for small business, as he promised he would. There's now a new small business that never existed before, the sale of guaranteed drug-free urine through the mail. Have any of you seen those ads? Yeah, it was one of the first things I saw when I got off the plane. I think it was somebody showed me an ad in Penthouse magazine, guaranteed drug-free urine. I thought, my God, Kafka should be alive today. He wouldn't believe it. Then other people showed me more of these ads, and they're all from the same post office box in Boulder, Colorado, which is a minor mystery, because how can you find drug-free urine in Boulder, Colorado? I've been in Boulder. I don't see how you can find drug-free urine within 150 miles of Boulder. But then I looked at the ads again, and it doesn't say human urine. It just says guaranteed drug-free urine. So I figure somebody in Boulder is getting rich selling cow piss through the mail. That's the spirit that made this country great. That's what's known as old-fashioned Yankee ingenuity. Where there's a market, there'll be a way to provide for the market. Although I kind of worry, there's somebody at Lockheed or somewhere one of these days is going to be called in and say, you passed your urine test for drugs, but you've got foot and mouth disease, and we're going to have to put you down. Now the government insists that people taking urine tests have to have a camera on them so that they can't use this guaranteed drug-free urine from Boulder. Have you heard about that? That's true. They're making them do it on camera now, which is, if that's not an invasion of privacy, I don't know what the hell would be. I don't think George Orwell came up with a more fantastic satire on totalitarianism and the concept of people peeing in front of a camera so the government can minutely examine their urine. And then there are guys, this is true, there are men who have a problem that's known as stricture in medical literature. Stricture is the inability to urinate while being observed. Some of the guys you see hanging around men's rooms for long periods of time are not gay. They have stricture. They're waiting until the room is empty because they can't urinate until the room is empty. This is obviously a psychogenic disease. Doesn't seem to be any innate biological cause of it. It has to do with traumatic experiences in childhood, no doubt. But all those guys are getting fired because they can't pee on camera. Well, as Mencken said, the United States remains the wonder and envy of all other and hence lesser nations. Reagan is obviously the intelligent people's president, in the same sense that Johnson was the pacifist president. And Johnson, by fighting the wrong war at the wrong time in the wrong place and using the most abominable weapons, such as napalm, which reaches 100 degrees Celsius on contact with human skin, he made war so unpopular that by 1968, 70% of the population was against the war. So I figured Johnson was the pacifist president. He made pacifism more popular than ever. And Nixon was the anarchist president. After 5 years of Nixon, people had a view of government indistinguishable from what you'll find in hardcore anarchist literature or in Machiavelli. We still have what I call Watergate fallout in the media, which is every time somebody appears on a film or television wearing a business suit with a solid color tie and says, "I'm from the government," everybody in the audience shivers. They know something terrible is going to happen. When I was young, it was guys in white laboratory smocks, usually Lionel Atwill or Bela Lugosi. they'd say, it worked on the mice, now we must try it on a higher species. But since Nixon, now it's just somebody who says, I'm from the government, and the whole audience goes, what's going to happen next? Then there was Gerald Ford, about whom the most memorable thing is that nobody can remember anything about him. And then there was Jimmy Carter, who was attacked by a killer rabbit. Did you remember that? Yeah, Jimmy Carter is the only president in American history to be a UFO witness and to be attacked by a giant rabbit. A killer rabbit, he claimed. And they withheld photographs of the killer rabbit after releasing the story to the press. The White House press secretary said, we've got photos that show the president was really swinging for his life. Some people thought Carter was drunk or stoned or something. But they said, we got photographs. It was a real killer rabbit. He was swinging for his life. And the press said, will you release the photos? And Rex Ingram said, some facts about the president must remain forever wrapped in obscurity. So that's all I remember about Jimmy Carter. He was the president who was attacked by a giant rabbit. I think he's the only ruler in the history of the world to be attacked by a killer rabbit since King Arthur. King Arthur was attacked by a killer rabbit in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And as a matter of fact, King Arthur sees a UFO in that film too. So maybe Jimmy Carter was a rerun of King Arthur in some sense. But Reagan is the intelligent people's president. He has made stupidity seem déclassé. And since I've been urging a war on stupidity for about 10 years, I think Reagan is the best thing that's happened to this country. Nowadays, everybody is a little bit embarrassed about stupidity. He's given it a bad name. We had a pope named John Paul, and then we got another one called John Paul II. And that was a terrible disappointment to me. I hoped he'd call himself John Paul Ringo, so we could look forward to the next one. It would be John Paul Ringo. Coincidences. Didn't I start out to talk about coincidences? Yes, the Ouija board that said the war would end on the 14th of August in 1945. According to one of my physics teachers in high school, that was a coincidence. And I don't know any way to prove it wasn't a coincidence. The only thing is, I told that story once on a radio station in Louisiana, and the interviewer said, instead of saying it was only a coincidence, he said, well, that was demons. And I looked at him for a minute. For once in my life, I was speechless. I didn't know what to say. I thought he was putting me on, but he was serious. Down in Louisiana, you got a lot of fundamentalist Christians, and they believe in demons. And they believe Ouija boards invoke demons. And I don't know any way to prove it wasn't a demon. Who else but a demon would know when the war was going to end? So maybe it was a demon, or maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was a synchronicity. Maybe my mother had precognition and was pushing the planchette around without realizing it. There was an article published last year by the psychologist Robert Persinger. He took 25 cases of well-documented precognitive experiences from parapsychological literature. And there are lots of well-documented cases of seeming precognition. Let's not call it precognition, because it might, there may be another explanation. What seems like precognition. He took 25 cases, the best documented ones in the literature. Now, the fundamentalist materialist explanation is it was all coincidence. The fundamentalist Christian explanation is it was demons. Persinger studied the 25 cases very closely, and it turned out they all happened at the time of month when geomagnetic activity was at a minimum. And all of them occurred in the 7-day period in which geomagnetic activity had been at its lowest point during the month leading up to the precognitive experience. So either coincidences are more active during geomagnetic activity, or demons are more active during geomagnetic activity, or both demons and coincidences are ad hoc explanations which don't fit the facts. I don't know. I do a lot of wondering. Have any of you read that new book called Communion? What's the author's name? Whitney? Nobody knows his name. Well, I'm glad you all remembered my name well enough to come here tonight. Whitney, Anyway, his first name is Whitney. I haven't read his book, so therefore I feel competent to express an opinion about it. If I read it, I would probably be confused. Facts usually confuse me. I do much better generalizing without any data. I think I share that habit with Ronald Reagan. Oh, why not? His middle name is Wilson. That must be a coincidence, too. I don't know why all the fundamentalists who support Reagan haven't noticed that Ronald has 6 letters, Wilson has 6 letters, and Reagan has 6 letters. So his name spells out 666. And the book of Revelation says the beast 666 will be wounded and then will arise stronger than ever. And Reagan was wounded, and then he rose up and got the biggest majority in American electoral history. I don't know why the fundamentalists don't worry about that. I worry about it. But this book, Communion, this fellow, Whitney with the mysterious last name, Stroud or Stryken or whatever it is, Striever? Okay, Whitney, good old Whitney. I saw him on Irish television, and he made a very interesting impression. He seemed quite sober and serious and sane, and more wondering about the experience than dogmatically proclaiming a doctrine on the basis of the experience. His experience was that he was in bed one night and a bunch of little green men came into the room, grabbed him, dragged him out, hauled him to some kind of contraption out in his yard and did a lot of scientific tests on him and then let him free again. He did not jump to the conclusion they were extraterrestrials. Although most of the people who've had that kind of experience or hallucination or whatever it is generally assume they are extraterrestrials. But that's only in our society. The Irish have been having that kind of experience for thousands of years, and they assume it's fairies. Or pukas, or something like that. I found Whitney very interesting because he didn't try to explain the experience. He was willing to discuss the possibility it was hallucination. He said if it's hallucination, it's one of the most interesting kinds of hallucination in psychiatry because it happens to people who are otherwise sane. He went and had himself checked by a psychiatrist right after the experience. And he claims to have letters from several hundred others who've had that experience who are not who do not seem unbalanced to the psychiatrists who've examined them. So it's a very interesting kind of hallucination, if it is a hallucination. I have a high tolerance for ambiguity, which interestingly Whitney said the psychiatrist he went to told him he would have to develop in dealing with such an experience. And back when the first books about UFOs appeared, arguing that they were from outer space, I thought, well, that's plausible, or it's possible at least. But of course, you can't prove it with the kind of evidence these books present. That's not a proof. That's just a plausible argument. And then out came the debunking books. I thought, well, they're fairly plausible too, but they haven't proven anything. They've just shown another plausible way of looking at it. And for years, there were just those two explanations. It's extraterrestrials or it's hallucinations. And then along came Jacques Vallée and pointed out how similar this type of experience was to the accounts given in the folklore of Ireland, Wales, France, especially Breton France and parts of Spain, where they've been attributing this type of thing to fairies or elves for thousands of years. And Vallée goes through the literature of the fairy belief in those parts of Europe and shows how closely it parallels the type of experience that nowadays is called extraterrestrial. Vallée says the assumption that extraterrestrials have been doing this for a couple of thousand years is rather extraordinary. Why would they be carrying on such a long-range study, and why does it seem so pointless, and why are they so careless about it? And He suggests that the extraterrestrial explanation is just the current explanation because it fits in with the categories of thought that most of us in the modern world are able to use comfortably. He suggests we need new categories of thought to understand such experiences. And I thought, yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I haven't developed those new categories of thought yet. I'm still working on it. But then Vallée came out with another book, Messengers of Deception, in which he offered a different model for the UFO experience. He suggested that the UFOs may be manufactured by an intelligence agency which is engaged in an experiment in modifying belief systems on a planetary scale. And he points out modern intelligence agencies have the finances and the technology and the secrecy to carry out such a project. And he presents a pretty good argument. So you come out of that book and you think, gee, maybe the CIA is doing it, or maybe it's the KGB, or maybe it's MI5. And that's plausible too, but I don't think Vallée proves it. He just makes it seem plausible. And then I read Space-Time Transients and Unusual Events by Persinger and Lafreniere. Anybody here ever heard of that book? It never got as big an audience as it should have. Persinger is the one I quoted earlier, who did that study of paranormal precognitive experiences. In Space-Time Transients and Unusual Events, he studies, he and Lafreniere, a graduate student, examined 6,000 cases of UFO contacts or other paranormal events that are outside the framework of consensus reality. He includes a lot of the Fortean data, like falls of fishes or falls of frogs. You know, frogs fall out of the sky almost every year somewhere in the world. Is that news to anybody here? This happens regularly. Since when I started researching my book, The New Inquisition, which came out last spring, I wanted to have some frog falls that were not in the books of Charles Fort, and I started looking around, and I found quite a few from the last 5 years alone, in Greece, in Russia, in Turkey, and even in England. Frogs keep falling out of the skies, even though nobody knows why. And fish fall out of the skies sometimes. And then there are mysterious animals that appear in strange places, like mountain lions being reported in downtown Berkeley, or kangaroos in the suburbs of Chicago, which has been going on for about 30 years. And Persinger and Lafreniere collected 6,000 cases of UFOs, jumping furniture, levitating mongoose, mysterious animals, and strange things falling out of the sky. And they did computer analysis of this data, looking for things that might correlate with such experiences. And they decided one correlation that seemed rather strong was that these things are more likely to occur on earthquake faults than anywhere else, and they're second most likely to occur in the paths frequently traveled by tornadoes or cyclones. And so they suggest there may be wobbles in the energy fields of the Earth, the electromagnetic and geomagnetic and gravitational fields. Those fields are not completely constant, as we've always thought, but they may wobble a little bit. And these wobbles can shake up furniture and throw things around in odd ways, and probably affect the human brain so that our brain waves become abnormal and we start hallucinating. And I thought, yeah, that's the most plausible theory I've ever heard about such experiences, because there's a topology, especially the UFO cases. People, if you draw up a diagram of a UFO case, you find people a few miles away report strange lights in the sky. People a little closer in tell strange stories of the type that were dramatized in the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The furniture jumped up and down, the television was turning itself on and off, the refrigerator door kept opening, the car motor stalled, the car headlights were going off and on, things like that, which do sound like electromagnetic fluctuations. And people who get into this epicenter seem to definitely have altered brain waves, because they come back saying, I saw Jesus Christ on a flying saucer, or I saw dwarfs in Nazi uniforms. That was the Betty and Barney Hill case. Or I was, a lot of Mexican women for some reason seem to be prone to come back saying I was raped by hairy little dwarfs. Whereas denizens of the southern United States, male denizens of the southern United States, are more likely to say I was seduced by a beautiful green-skinned woman from Venus. One guy even married a woman from Venus, he claimed. I tend to think that one was a put-on, though. But I hope nobody thinks I've just explained UFOs and poltergeists. That's only one way of looking at them. That's one model. It seems like a very useful and intriguing model, and I hope there'll be more research on it, especially since Persinger has done that follow-up study showing that precognition seems to correlate with geomagnetic activity too, or with low geomagnetic activity. Last night I saw again Orson Welles' film F for Fake, and that is one of my favorite films. It may be my favorite film of all time, and for the same reasons that Joyce's Ulysses is my favorite novel of all time. I bet nobody here has seen F for Fake. Has anybody here ever seen it? My God, too. Yeah, that movie was really never got the audience it deserves. Maybe I can help build up an audience for it. F for Fake is a fake movie about a fake biography of an art faker. The central character, more or less, is Elmire, who was the greatest art forger of the 20th century. He was versatile. Previous art forgers have specialized in one or two artists, but Elmire was doing Van Goghs and Cezannes and Modiglianis and Rembrandts and damn near everybody. It is believed by many that there are Elmires hanging in every major museum in the world still. Which makes sense because the experts who authenticated them would look less like experts if they announced we've changed our minds and we now think they're forgeries. So the experts have a vested interest in insisting this is really a Rembrandt because we said it was a Rembrandt 20 years ago. Of course, Elmire, of course, insists on that throughout the movie. He thinks the cream of the jest is that most of his frauds have never been discovered. And he won't say where they are. He just drops hints about certain, a lot of United States museums have my work, yes. Quite a few in France, yes. And, there was a biography written of Elmire by Clifford Irving. It was called Fake. And history moves so fast these days, some of you may have forgotten who Clifford Irving was. Clifford Irving, after writing this biography of Elmire, got commissioned by a major New York publisher to write a biography of Howard Hughes on the basis of a contract he had with Howard Hughes, which was signed by Howard Hughes. And then some people started claiming this was a hoax because nobody had seen Howard Hughes in a long time. And there were always wiseacres around trying to screw up somebody's act. And they kept saying Clifford Irving doesn't have any evidence that he's really got Howard Hughes except that signature. So Clifford Irving submitted the signature to experts on handwriting, and they all testified, yes, that's Howard Hughes' signature. And by then, the Howard Hughes biography had gotten so much publicity that Howard Hughes, without coming out of his exile or his hiding or whatever you call living in that one room, Howard Hughes made a telephone call in which he told one of the major newspapers that he did not sign a contract with Clifford Irving, that the signature was a forgery, and that he had no contact with Clifford Irving at all. Clifford Irving had told a wonderfully romantic story about meeting Howard Hughes on top of a pyramid in Mexico, which is good enough for the beginning of a UFO story. Howard Hughes said it never happened. If that was really Howard Hughes on the phone, some people claim Howard Hughes had been murdered years before and somebody else was impersonating him. Anyway, the weight of the evidence seemed to indicate that Clifford Irving had committed a fraud, and he was prosecuted for it. And this movie is about Irving's Howard Hughes hoax and Elmire's art hoaxes, and the biography Irving wrote of Elmire. And the question was Clifford Irving telling the truth in his biography of Elmire? Since we know he can't be trusted about Howard Hughes, can he be trusted about Elmire? And if Clifford Irving is telling the truth about Elmire according to his standards, is that the real truth? How much was Elmire deceiving Clifford Irving? Well, Clifford Irving was writing the biography of Elmire. And Orson Welles announces at the beginning of the film, although this is a movie about fakery and flim-flam, everything we are going to tell you in the next hour is completely true. And towards the end of the hour, there comes a scene in which Elmire says that he didn't commit any crimes because he never signed the paintings. Somebody else signed the paintings. He's a bit evasive about who signed the paintings. And then Welles cuts to a close-up of Clifford Irving, and Irving says, oh, he's lying about that. He signed the paintings. And then Welles asks, and who did the Howard Hughes signature? And then there's a close-up of Irving and a close-up of Elmire and a close-up of Irving and a close-up of Elmire, and they're not saying anything. And it's a heavy, pregnant, guilty silence. Except that's a fake. Welles never interviewed Elmire or Clifford Irving. Welles bought newsreel footage of them from BBC and edited it, put himself into it, and made it look like an interview. So it's a fake movie about a fake biography of a fake artist, as I said. Only most of the audience don't get the joke. Welles didn't want people to get the joke. He wanted the joke to come out gradually over the years. In one part of the movie, Welles tells about the well-known story about how his acting career began. When he was 16 and trying to make a success as a painter, Welles seems to identify with Elmire, who had a remarkable lack of success as a painter as long as he was putting his own signatures on the paintings. Elmire's success only began when he started signing his paintings Rembrandt or Vincent or Modigliani. Welles was not doing very well at selling his paintings. He was traveling around Ireland, and he got to Dublin, and he was out of paint and out of food, and he didn't even have any more canvas. And he walked into the Gate Theatre and told them he was a star of the Broadway stage who was in Ireland and was willing to do some work at their theatre over the summer. And they hired him. And Welles says, and I've been an acting forger ever since. Well, the curious thing about that sequence, Welles has told that story many times, but BBC did a documentary about Welles shortly before his death, and they interviewed Michael McLearmore, who was one of the two managers of the Gate, as well as being their major director and their leading star most of the time. Hilton Edwards was the producer, and McLearmore was the actor most of the time, although Edwards acted sometime too. I lived on the same street in Howth where McLearmore and Edwards used to live, which brings me into the story by synchronicity or coincidence. In this documentary on Welles, McLearmore appears and says, Welles did not deceive us for a minute. When he walked in that door of the Gate Theatre claiming to be 19 years old and having a career on Broadway behind him, Edwards and I both knew he was faking. We at first place, we knew he wasn't 19. He was obviously younger. We figured he was about 16. And we knew he didn't have any experience. That was obvious because we read the New York papers. We knew who the actors were who were appearing on Broadway. And they showed this clip to Orson Welles on this documentary about him. And Welles says, well, McLearmore is faking. And the interviewer says, why? Welles says, oh, just out of vanity. He wants to make himself more important. But the fact is, I was hired by Hilton Edwards. McLearmore was in London that weekend. He came back. I was already working for the Gate Theatre. Now we'll never know. Is Welles' version of how he got hired by the Gate true? Did he really deceive them? But did they just decide to hire him even though they knew he was a fake because they could see he was a talented fake? We'll never know the truth. But an even more interesting Orson Welles mystery is the one about Rosebud. I bet everybody here has seen Citizen Kane, even though only 2 of you have seen F for Fake, right? How many of you have seen Citizen Kane? And you all know what the mysterious word Rosebud means. Although you probably don't know that if you take binoculars with you when you see 2001, you can read the word Rosebud on the bottom of the black monolith. Well, you can see it if you're in the proper state of consciousness anyway, along with having the binoculars. I was once hired to write an introduction to a book by a chap who saw Masonic symbols on the moon. he contacted me through my literary agent and offered me $500 to write an introduction to this book, and I said, sure. I was broke at that time. I'd do anything for $500. And so I agreed to write the introduction, and he wasn't satisfied with me just writing the introduction. He wanted me to believe his thesis. So he kept sending me these blow-ups he had made of NASA photographs. And in his letters he said, look at them through a magnifying glass. It's much clearer that way. So I'd sit there looking at these photographs through a magnifying glass, and every now and then I would see a Masonic symbol on the moon. And I called my wife and I say, hey, Arlen, look at this. Do you see that? Do you see that? And she'd say, it's just a blurry shadow. You're stoned again. And it was like the famous photographs that Jim Garrison had of the assassin on the grassy knoll in Dallas. If you were in one state of mind, it was just a blotchy bunch of shadows on the trees. If you were in another state of mind, you could see the top of a head and a rifle pointing out. And there are still people in the country who insist they see it only one of those ways. I could always see it both of those ways, depending on which way I wanted to look at it. And it was the same with these Masonic symbols on the moon. The funny end of that story is, after I wrote the introduction, this guy sent me a letter and said he wasn't going to publish the book because an Air Force officer had come to him and told him he'd be assassinated if he published it. I still don't know what to think about that one. I think the man was a paranoid myself, but then again, maybe the Air Force, I don't know. On this lecture tour, the question I have been asked most often is, do you believe the CIA created AIDS? And my answer is, how would I know? I haven't seen any evidence to indicate they did it. So I generally turn it back to the questioner. Do you have any evidence that they did it? Well, no, but there's a lot of rumors going around. That's the power of the CIA. Everything evil in the world is attributed to them now. That's the greatest power you can have, is to be considered the origin of all evil. Curiously enough, last week I went to the Libertarian Supper Club in Redondo Beach, California. That's down south of LA. I was down there at the time. It was right after the earthquake I was talking about before. And they were going to have a speaker who was a journalist on a local newspaper. She was going to talk about the evidence that the CIA did create AIDS. And after hearing this question for 3 months on this lecture tour, I thought, boy, now I'll hear some facts finally. So I went to the lecture, and she never showed up. So everybody sat around for 2 hours making nervous jokes about, are we going to read in the paper that her car went off the road accidentally like Karen Silkwood? Well, the next day I heard from the chap who organizes those lectures. He got a phone call from her. She said she thought it was the lecture was the following night. If it was her, and if it wasn't an actress the CIA hired to impersonate her on the phone. Personally, I think if AIDS didn't just happen like most diseases, if anybody created it, I would suspect the Vatican. It's got everybody acting like a Catholic now. You see more and more of these ads for sex by phone. You know, you dial a number and a woman comes on and makes all sorts of suggestive conversation. Some people think it's the only safe form of sex that's left. Some of them even put a condom over the telephone just to be on the safe side. At least that's contributed to one work of art. A chap I met up in Vancouver has made a tape in which he cut one of those. He recorded one of those sexy phone conversations and then intercut it with a Ronald Reagan speech. And it's one of the most hilarious tapes I've ever heard. Reagan is going on and on about the evil empire, and she's saying, oh, I'm coming. And Reagan is saying, they threaten our very existence. And she's crying, I'm still coming. And it's really wonderful. I like that kind of humor. But most people think they know what Rosebud means in Citizen Kane. It's the name on the sled. And the sled, of course, is what Kane was holding as a little boy when he was told he was going to be separated from his mother. However, in a recent biography of Wells revealed to the biographer that he actually got the idea for Rosebud from a former servant of Hearst's who worked at San Simeon down there where Hearst had his mansion. And according to the servant, Rosebud was Hearst's pet name for the genitalia of his mistress, Marion Davis. He called it Rosebud. Isn't that sweet? And I read that and I thought, gee, that gives a whole new dimension to the movie. And then I thought, wait a minute. Wells doesn't give the name and address of the servant. How do I know he didn't make that one up? Now, to everybody who reads that biography, when we see Citizen Kane over again, we see a whole new level of meaning in it. Of course, Citizen Kane always had that quality. Every time you see it, you find new shades of meaning, new emphasis, new possible interpretations. But now we got this whole new one. It refers to the sex life of the hero, the Rosebud. But does it? Did Wells just make that up? Did he decide he didn't, since he couldn't get the money to reshoot Citizen Kane, he would just add something to it by creating a new legend? I don't know. As I said, Wells is my favorite film director. My favorite novelist is James Joyce. I had a spooky Joycean experience last Bloomsday. Bloomsday is June 16th. That's the day on which the events of Ulysses take place. June 16th, 1904 in Dublin. And last year, the Dublin Evening Herald asked me to write a review of the corrected edition of Ulysses, in which 3 German scholars have brought forth what they claim is a corrected edition, correcting all the errors that have been in previous editions of Ulysses, of which they claim there are over 1,000. And so I sat down and read the corrected edition and looked occasionally at the standard edition to see what changes they had made and so on, and I found 3 mistakes in the corrected edition. One of them, they spell Avoca with an O, and Avoca is A-V-O-C-A. They spell it O-V-O-C-A, so they didn't look at a map of Ireland while they were doing their corrections. So now we're going to have the standard Ulysses and the corrected Ulysses, and both of them have mistakes, which is just the way Joyce wanted it, I'm sure. Anyway, I took the review into the Dublin Evening. They asked me to bring it in on Bloomsday, which was interesting in itself, though that was a good day to turn the review in, of course. On Bloomsday, June 16th, I went into the office of the Dublin Evening Herald at noon. They asked me to come in around noon, and I'm crossing the lobby, and I suddenly remembered this is the building where in 1904 the Freeman's Journal was. Since then, the Freeman's Journal went out of business, and now there's a new newspaper in there, the Dublin Evening Herald. But in 1904, the Freeman's Journal was there, and at noon, in the fictitious 1904 of Ulysses, at noon, the first major synchronicity of the novel occurs because Stephen Dedalus crosses the lobby in one direction and Leopold Bloom crosses the lobby in the other direction, and they don't notice each other, but their lives are going to be intertangled throughout the rest of the day, and they're going to keep encountering each other until the climax of the novel. And that's one of the major uses of synchronicity by Joyce in Ulysses. And I'm thinking, gee, and I'm crossing the same lobby where Bloom almost met Stephen, except that they're fictitious and I think I'm real. At least most of the time I think I'm real. If I have less than 500 mics of acid in me, I tend to think I'm real. And I'm real and they're fictitious, and yet I'm crossing the same lobby in which they almost met, except that they didn't because they didn't exist. And yet they seem to be more real in some sense than most people, because there's been so much written about Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom. They're the major figures in Irish literature. And so I handed in my review, and I left the Evening Herald still mulling over that synchronicity, and my wife Arlen and I went down to the Ormond Bar, which was close, a good place to have lunch. Of course, Bloom goes to the Ormond Bar in Ulysses. And so we're sitting in the Ormond Bar, and I'm thinking, gee, I'm following Bloom's tracks. I walk through the Evening Herald office, which used to be the Freeman's Journal. Now I'm in the Ormond Bar. And then I heard somebody at the bar reading aloud from Ulysses. Well, you couldn't call that a synchronicity. On Bloomsday in Dublin, there's bound to be somebody reading aloud from Ulysses no matter where you go. Bloomsday is a major economic event in in Ireland, because it brings in a lot of tourists who are Joyce fans, and it swells the bank accounts of all the hotels and B&Bs and so on. So you're bound to run into somebody reading from Ulysses. But then we finished our lunch and we left the Ormond, and Arlen asked me what time it was, and I looked at my watch and I found out my watch had stopped. And Bloom's watch stopped in 1904 while he was in the Ormond bar. I thought, my God, I'm moving in perfect harmony with Bloom, except Bloom isn't real and I am. And yet Bloom was moving in perfect harmony with Odysseus, because Ulysses is already built on a major synchronicity. Bloom's adventures during that day parallel the adventures of Odysseus in the Odyssey, except that Odysseus didn't have a watch that stopped. That was one of Joyce's additions. The most interesting character in Ulysses, as far as I'm concerned, is Gary Owen. Bloom is a great character. Molly Bloom is a great character. Stephen is a great character. Buck Mulligan is a great character. There are a lot of great characters in Ulysses. My favorite character is Gary Owen, because there are three versions of Gary Owen in the novel. I call this the Gary Owen principle. All of my novels are based on the Gary Owen principle. The first time Gary Owen is described, the narrator is a drunken Dublin barfly who's hostile to everybody in Dublin. This narrator puts down all the characters in the novel and everybody else in Dublin, and the King of England to boot, and the Germans and the French and everybody in Europe. And of course he doesn't like the dog either. He says Gary Owen is a mangy mongrel with a vile temper, and it would be a corporal work of mercy to do away with that dog before he eats the seat out of somebody else's trousers. And then another narrator comes in and tells you that Gary Owen speaks pure Gaelic and actually recites classic Gaelic verse according to the meters of the medieval Irish bards, and gives you a sample of the poetry composed by this dog. And a little bit later, another narrator named Gertie McDowell comes in, and she tells you that Gary Owen is a darling dog, so human that he almost talks. At least she doesn't claim he does talk. She says he almost talks. So we got three versions of Gary Owen. And Joyce never tells you which is true, because the difference between Ulysses and all novels previous to Ulysses is that Joyce doesn't assume there is an objective reality separate from us. Joyce has the quantum mechanical point of view that every perceived reality is a function of the observer as much as it is of the system being observed. Observer and observed are a seamless unity. So in one universe, Gary Owen is a horrible mongrel. In another universe, Gary Owen is a darling dog. And in a third universe, Gary Owen recites Irish poetry. It depends on who the observer is. And that's exactly what Orson Welles told the biographer in this biography, where he revealed the truth, or invented the myth, that Rosebud referred to Marion Davies' vagina. In this biography, Wells told the biographer, don't try to tell the truth about me. You can never find out the truth about me. You're not God. The theme of the biography is your attempt to find out the truth about Orson Welles. And so the biography is structured that way. The biographer agreed with Wells, and she wrote it that way, which is the structure of Citizen Kane and the structure of F for Fake, and the structure of all of Wells' films, and all of my novels, and the structure of Ulysses. It's not an attempt to tell the truth, but it's a description of somebody's attempt to find out the truth, which often encounters gravel, as in F for Fake, where all the major characters are lying to us, or in Ulysses, where all the narrators are so obviously prejudiced you can't trust any of them. And in my novels, where the characters are all stoned or frightened or in one way in an altered state of consciousness, and they all have a different reality tunnel. That is the only universe I believe in, is the universe tuned in by the human nervous system. The idea that there is some kind of universe that exists apart from us, I think, is a medieval Aristotelian myth. Bucky Fuller used to say we shouldn't use the words existence and non-existence at all. They imply that we know something we can never know. All we know is what's tuned in. And what isn't tuned in, we don't know whether it's non-existent or not. All we know is that it's not tuned in. So I've been practicing for years, not thinking about existence and non-existence, just thinking about the tuned in and the not tuned in. I find this describes perfectly my experience. Some things I tune in, some things I don't tune in. Some things that I don't tune in for years, suddenly I find I have the ability to tune in. Some things that I've been tuning in for years, I find I can tune out. And with any scientific instrument, no matter how many instruments you use, All you know is what's tuned in by that instrument. If you use 5 instruments, you get 5 different types of things that can be tuned in, but each one is relative to the instrument. In the famous 2-hole experiment in quantum mechanics, if you flash light at a screen with 2 holes in it, you get a wave pattern on the screen behind the first screen, which proves that light is really waves. But if you close one of the holes and throw the beam of light at it, you get a pattern, a quantum pattern, that indicates that light is really particles. If you then open 2 holes again, you get the wave pattern. So light is particles when you're using the instrument one way, and it's waves when you're using it the other way. Just like Gary Owen is a darling old dog from one observer's point of view and a horrible old mongrel from another observer's point of view. All we know is the tuned in. We never know the not tuned in. And all I know is that when my mother asked the Ouija board when would the war end, it gave her a correct answer. I don't know why it gave a correct answer. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe it was precognition. We know our experience. The theories we make up about our experience are generally more than anybody can ever know. Every theory contains the built-in assumption that somebody has figured out the whole universe, because no theory is complete unless it includes the whole universe. And I don't see how any theory can include the whole universe unless it's exactly the same size as the whole universe, with as much data in it as the universe. Since nobody has produced such a theory yet, I think all theories should be considered works of art. And that's what I like about quantum mechanics. In quantum mechanics, you get different viewpoints on the same phenomenon. You got 8 major models in quantum mechanics and new ones coming along all the time, just as you have 8 major models about what was happening to Citizen Kane. And in F for Fake, you got at least 8,000 possible explanations of who's lying and who's telling the truth in any given scene. And so I think I have developed a high tolerance of ambiguity over the years, and I think a high tolerance of ambiguity doesn't make life more confusing, it makes life more interesting. Knowing how little I know, I pay closer attention to what's going on, because I know I don't know. I'm continually astonished at how many people know things that I don't know and that I don't understand how anybody can know. After years of pondering monetary economics, I made bold in a talk in New York a while back to propose that since most countries can't pay their debts to the international banks anymore, and everybody is speculating who's going to default first, and for the last 5 years the banks have been loaning countries the money to pay the interest on their debts, which just gets them deeper in debt and adds to the amount they're going to have to pay next year, I suggested maybe we should establish a UN currency. After all, banks didn't always create the currency in the world. Back before the 19th century, every nation created its own currency. It was only after the countries came to the conclusion they couldn't trust one another that by default the bankers became the creators of currency in the modern world. And since now everybody's so deep in debt to the banks that nobody can pay them off anymore, I suggested maybe the UN should take over the creation of currency. And if all the member nations were participating in it and supervising it, they'd be sure it wouldn't be a debased currency such as governments used to issue, which is why they lost the power to issue currency. And I thought that might work out. And somebody in the audience looked away for 30 seconds and then spoke up and said it wouldn't work. And I thought, my God, I've got a genius in the audience. I travel all around the world. This guy, I just have the good luck to arrive here where I encounter somebody who in 30 seconds can figure out whether an idea that complicated would work or not. I can't figure things out like that. It took me 30 years to think up that idea, and for the last 30 months I've been thinking about whether it will work or not, whether it is a good idea or not. It seems most people have a correct answer machine in their heads. Michael Hoy, who's my favorite publisher, he publishes Lone Panic's books. He publishes books on how to cheat on your income tax and how to pick locks and how to grow your own marijuana in the closet and how to rip off automatic bank machines, all sorts of controversial books. He recently brought forth what may be the ballsiest book he's ever published, How to Cheat a Professional Dope Dealer. Now, I travel so much that among my circle of acquaintances there's one of everything, so I know a professional dope dealer in New York. And I told him about that book, or at least I thought I did. He said, "Are you kidding? I bought the first copy." That's the great thing about Lone Panic's books. The people who need them get them. Michael Hoy wrote an article recently for a magazine called Critique in which he gave a little parable. Supposing somebody told you, I've got a correct answer machine, and he said, well, let's see how it works. And so he started feeding into the machine all the questions you asked, and the machine came back with a great deal of what was straight Marxist, Moscow hardline Marxist propaganda and regular Marxist jargon. And after 5 or 10 questions, you say, hey, that's not a correct answer machine, that's a Marxist propaganda machine. And the inventor says, oh no, this is the correct answer machine. It seems the Marxists have the correct answer, and the machine is just giving the correct answer because the correct answer happens to be the Marxist answer. And you think, this guy's trying to kid me, he's just a propagandist for Marxism. So you leave in a disillusioned mood, and the guy in the next window says, psst, hey, I got the real correct answer machine. So you go in and you ask his machine 10 questions, and you get 10 answers of straight Libertarian Party philosophy and stranded Libertarian jargon. And you say, you don't have a correct answer machine either. You just got a Libertarian propaganda machine. He says, oh no, the Libertarian Party line happens to be the correct answer to everything. And Hoy says, the strange thing is we wouldn't believe in such machines, but most of us think we do have such a correct answer machine in our heads. And I think that's how the fellow in New York took only 30 seconds to figure out whether a UN currency would work or not. He had a correct answer machine in his head. What I'm trying to do in all my books and seminars and in my lectures is to take the correct answer machine out of people's heads. And I hope they enjoy the process and feel it is liberating. Those who are frightened or dismayed by it, well, I'm sorry. That just happens to be my avocation in this lifetime, is disconnecting correct answer machines. And I think we will now have a break, and I will come back and give you a chance to ask questions, and that can go on as long as you want or until the time is up. Thank you.
15 minutes?
Oh, only about 10.
Okay.
I just want to
Okay, we're going to take about a 10-minute break. There is free coffee and cookies out in the lobby. Please.
How many Freemasons does it take to change a light bulb? That's a craft secret. Okay, that's my question. Does anybody else have any questions? Yes?
Right across any good conspiracies like that you haven't already, been in touch with?
Any good conspiracies lately besides the CIA and AIDS?
Or new twist on the already talked about?
Well, I think the most interesting thing that's happened in the conspiracy field lately is the fact that Licio Gelli has surrendered himself to the Swiss authorities. That's really weird. I can't figure that one out at all. Licio Gelli. Well, Licio Gelli was indicted in Italy for planning a coup to overthrow the government, for infiltrating 900 members of his Pei Due lodge into the government, for conspiracy in several bombings that had occurred, and for conspiracy in connection with the stock and currency frauds of the Banco Ambrosiano and the Vatican Bank and the Franklin National Bank in this country, and for a couple of dozen other offenses. He had so many agents in the secret police in Italy that when they came to arrest him, he had been tipped off in advance, and he escaped from Italy. Although he didn't have time to clean out his files, and they found this list of 900 Pei Due agents in the government and a position paper he had written called The Strategy of Tension, which was about how to knock off a democratic government by creating so much chaos that people would feel they needed a fascist government, which was the motive behind the bombings that Gelli was evidently involved in. He went to Uruguay, where he had formerly helped Klaus Barbie find employment with the CIA, and he seemed to be invulnerable in Uruguay because they have no extradition treaty with Italy. Two of his colleagues in these stock and currency frauds were Roberto Calvi, the president of Banco Ambrosiano, who was found hanging from a bridge in London, where the rising tide had covered his dead body, which is the punishment threatened for Freemasons who betray other Freemasons, which strongly suggests that he was killed by his fellow Freemasons or by people who wish us to think he was killed by his fellow Freemasons. And the other major collaborator in the stock and currency frauds was Michele Sindona, who was convicted in New York of 65 counts of fraud and in Rome of murdering a bank examiner, and was then poisoned in his cell while awaiting trial on conspiracy charges in connection with the Bologna railway bombing. Anyway, Jelly was safe in Uruguay, and then he popped up in Switzerland to take some money out of a numbered bank account, and the Swiss recognized him and held him for extradition to Italy. And they managed to hold him for a grand total of 3 days, although the Swiss are alleged to have the most incorruptible police in Europe. But in 3 days, Jelly disappeared out of a maximum security prison and flew back to Uruguay, where he was joined by his wife, who left Rome at the same time he left the prison in Switzerland, suggesting a great deal of collaborative effort on his escape. I was in Switzerland recently, and I suggested they should make a tourist attraction out of that prison by putting above the gates the 3 monkeys, see no evil, speak no evil, and hear no evil, and the motto, Ficken Sie nicht mit die Freimaurer, which is German for don't fuck around with the Freemasons. There have been a lot of books on the Jelly case and the Pay-Douay conspiracy. About half of them claim he was working for the CIA, and there seems to be pretty good evidence of that. The other half claim he was working for the KGB, and there seems to be pretty good evidence of that, too. It appears that Senor Jelly was very good at working for both sides in the Cold War, but it seems that back during World War II he was doing that already. He was working for the Gestapo and the Communist Underground simultaneously during World War II. He's a colorful character. I think he's going to be remembered as the archetypical 20th century man, the way Thomas Jefferson is the archetypical 18th century man, and Leonardo is the archetypical Renaissance man. Anyway, to my great astonishment, after Jelly escaped from the prison in Switzerland and got back to Uruguay, he suddenly appeared a few weeks ago in Switzerland and turned himself into the authorities. And I'm still trying to figure that one out. All I can figure is the fix is in at a very high level. Of course, Jelly was at Reagan's second inaugural. There's a photo of Jelly and Reagan at the inauguration ball, and they're laughing at something. And I've always wondered, what the hell are they laughing about that I don't know? If I knew that, maybe that would explain why Jelly came back and surrendered. It's a profound mystery. Jelly was a Knight of Malta, as well as a Freemason. I find that especially interesting, because the Freemasons are sworn to eternal war against the Knights of Malta. That's in the 32nd degree initiation. And the Knights of Malta, I think, have a similar oath of hostility to the Freemasons. I'm not sure whether Jelly was working for the CIA and betraying the KGB, or working for the KGB and betraying the CIA, and I'm not sure whether he was working for the Knights of Malta or for the Freemasons. I suspect it was the Knights of Malta plot, in essence, that he was masterminding, and he joined the Freemasons so that if the thing ever did break, the Freemasons would get blamed for it instead of the Knights of Malta. But that's because I have a Machiavellian mind. But you got to think that way if you want to understand Italian politics. Alan Watts said to me once, the greatest error of professional historians is their belief that the Roman Empire fell. It never fell. It still controls the Western world through the Mafia and the Vatican. And every year that passes since Alan said that to me, I see more evidence that he was right. That's a rather prolonged answer to your question, but that's my current thinking about the major conspiratorial activities in Europe currently. Yes?
Will we be seeing the third volume of the Illuminatus Chronicles in 1987 or 88?
In 88, not in 87. I haven't finished it, for one thing, which that's why you won't see it this year. The publisher went bankrupt. And so I had to wait till my agent found a new publisher, which he has. The series will now be published by Lynx Books in Boston. And I'll finish the third volume soon. But meanwhile, I got a contract to write a screenplay, so I'm trying to get the screenplay done as quickly as possible so I can get back to the novel.
Tell us about that.
The screenplay? It's called Reality is What You Can Get Away With. And that's all I am at liberty to divulge at this point. It's a Hollywood belief that if you talk about a screenplay, somebody will rip it off. That's a deeply held religious belief in Hollywood, just like the deeply held religious belief in Italy that every politician can be bribed. In Hollywood, the belief is that any idea that's spoken aloud will be swiped immediately. I don't know how such paranoid ideas get in circulation, except that I have a friend who did get one of his ideas ripped off. You've all heard of the idea. It became the movie The Towering Inferno. The guy who wrote that, Frank Robinson, he got ripped off by somebody else who rushed another book into print with the same idea after he heard Frank talking about it with the Hollywood producer who was going to make the movie. And they had to settle out of court because the producer had Steve McQueen and Paul Newman lined up to star. When you get two heavy talents like that, you can't afford delays while the cases are fought through the courts. So they were ordered to settle out of court. And so Frank did get ripped off from the conventional point of view. The other guy had a good lawyer, of course. But they're not using rats anymore at the National Science Institute in their research. They're using California lawyers now. That's because in the first place there are more California lawyers than there are rats. And in the second place, the technicians do not develop emotional attachments to lawyers. And in the third place, there are some things you can't get a rat to do.